What if the Roman Empire had never fallen? What if the night of history had never arrived and the flame of Rome had burned through the centuries, fueled not by glory, but by an insatiable hunger? Close your eyes. Imagine ruins that never existed, colosseums that never crumbled, roads that were never lost to the dust of time. Imagine a golden eagle that never lowered its wings, but kept flying higher and farther until it covered the entire world with its shadow. In our reality, Rome collapsed in 476 AD. Corruption, famine, barbarian invasions, the empire crumbled like marble cracked by time. The collapse paved the way for chaos, for centuries of darkness and stagnation. The flame of knowledge nearly went out. But what if it hadn't? What if Rome had endured, if it had repelled the invaders, tamed its internal crises, reinvented its administration, and preserved its unity? An eternal empire would not only mean better roads or safer cities. It would mean an unbreakable, suffocating order, crushing all alternative possibilities for the future. A single center, a single language, a single iron fist ruling over millions, billions. And here lies a dilemma that seeps in like poison. Would a world under eternal Rome be a paradise of progress or an endless prison? Rome was not just engineering and discipline. Rome was brutality. It was large-scale slavery. It was blood spilled in arenas, turned into spectacle. Now imagine that not for centuries, but for millennia. Without a fall, there would be no rebirth. Without collapse, no space for new cultures to flourish freely. There would be no Shakespeare, no Renaissance, no French Revolution. There would only be the continuity of the imperial machine, perfected with each generation, ever more efficient, ever more relentless. What we lost with Rome's fall may be far less than what we could have lost with its survival. Think of the empire reaching places that, in our history, were only touched centuries later. Rome would have crossed oceans. Rome would have discovered distant lands. Rome would have taken the entire world before it could even dream of being free. And so arises the first disturbing revelation. An empire that never falls would not be a glorious empire, but an endless nightmare, a prison with invisible walls, where there is no outside, where there is no tomorrow. But that is only the surface. For if Rome had never fallen, the very first destiny to be altered would have been that of the so-called New World. What if Rome had reached the Americas centuries before any other people? What would have happened to civilizations like the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Inca in the face of the imperial eagle? What if Rome had reached the New World 1,000 years before Columbus? What if the first sails seen by the peoples of the Americas were not Christian crosses, but golden standards bearing the imperial eagle? In our timeline, the Maya, Aztec, and Inca peoples flourished in relative isolation until the brutal arrival of Europeans. But in a world where Rome never fell, history would not have waited. Massive ships, sturdier than the fragile caravels we know, would have crossed the Atlantic long before the 15th century, not driven by chance or shipwrecks, but by cold calculation, by ruthless strategy. When the legions disembarked, they would not bring gospels. They would not raise crosses. What would march across the beaches of the New World was the very embodiment of Roman order, discipline, iron, and hunger for power. The peoples of the Americas would see their cities devoured not by immediate fire, but by something even more cruel, absorption. Rome did not immediately destroy what it could use. Mayan temples turned into fortresses. Aztec ziggurats adorned with bronze eagles. Incan roads converted into perfect routes for the advance of the legions. Gold, maize, cacao, advanced mathematics, sophisticated astronomy, all would be absorbed into the imperial machine. There would be no swift, brutal clash, but a slow, irresistible process of assimilation. These civilizations would survive physically, but their soul would be erased. And here lies the darkest revelation. Unlike the immediate annihilation we know, the peoples of the Americas would have been swallowed by Rome and forgotten within it. Their languages dissolved into Latin. Their gods reduced to decorative statues in temples dedicated to the emperor. Their histories recorded not as glories, but as footnotes and scrolls written by senators. The diversity we know today might never have existed. The world would have become global 1,000 years earlier, but a world with one voice, one order, one shadow. Imagine golden eagles planted atop Aztec pyramids. The chants of native peoples silenced by choirs repeating Ave Caesar, a fusion of cultures, not to create something new, but to reinforce the eternity of Rome. But if Rome absorbed a new world, imagine what it would do with the power gained from it. Knowledge, wealth, resources, all directed not toward freedom, but toward expanding the imperial machine. And what if Rome had discovered modern science centuries before us and used every invention not to liberate, but to control? What if Rome had discovered modern science 1,000 years before us? What if telescopes pointed to the stars in the year 1000? What if steam engines powered legions in the year 1100? What if gunpowder roared in arenas long before China's powder reached Europe? In our reality, the fall of Rome delayed humanity by centuries. The Middle Ages were marked by slowness, by shadows, by painful restarts. But in an empire that never fell, there would have been no interruption. Every library preserved, every engineer supported, every discovery multiplied. Rome was not a people that stopped before the unknown. Where there was a river, it built bridges. Where there was desert, it opened roads. Where there were barriers, it raised siege machines. If it had survived, it would have applied that same logic to nature itself. But here lies the dilemma. In our reality, science and freedom often walked hand in hand. Inventions liberated ideas, shattered dogmas, opened horizons. In Rome, it would not have been so. Science would serve the empire. Telescopes to map lands yet to be conquered. Presses not to spread ideas, but to reinforce imperial decrees. Gunpowder not for celebration, but to crush revolts. Knowledge would be a weapon. Innovation, a chain. And here is a terrifying revelation. Rome would not only advance faster, it would advance differently. Imagine electricity not used to light cities, but to power electrified walls. Steam engines not in free factories, but in mechanized legions. Medicine not as a promise of health, but as a guarantee of tireless soldiers. The very idea of progress would be distorted. To advance would not mean to live better. It would mean to live more controlled. And then, the most disturbing vision, Rome gazing at the sky with eyes of iron. Centuries before NASA, before rockets, before the very idea of space. The moon, not as a symbol of poetry, but as a future province. A golden eagle standard planted in lunar soil, not in 1969, but perhaps in the year 1400. But if Rome conquered not only the earth, but also the heavens, the next step would be inevitable. When physical space is mastered, only one frontier remains to be broken, the space within the mind. What if Rome had controlled not only the bodies of its citizens, but also their beliefs, their thoughts, their most intimate dreams? What if Rome had not been content with dominating lands and bodies? What if the empire had learned to conquer the human mind itself? What if the true wall of Rome was not built of stone, but of thoughts? In our reality, the fall of Rome made room for chaos, diversity, and a multiplicity of voices. New religions flourished, new philosophies emerged, new spiritual worlds were born. But in an eternal empire, such fragmentation would never exist. There would be only one voice, the voice of Rome, the voice of the emperor. The science that once forged weapons and machines would now turn inward, toward the invisible, the human psyche. Imagine schools not to teach, but to program. Theaters not to entertain, but to indoctrinate. Libraries not to preserve all ideas, but to select only those that reinforce order. The emperor would cease to be merely a ruler. He would become a god, not through the spontaneous faith of the people, but through conscious, calculated manipulation. With early advances in medicine and chemistry, Rome could have discovered ways to control emotions, to induce states of obedience, to suppress individual will. Bread and circuses, which were already tools of distraction, would become weapons of mass conditioning. The people would laugh when the empire wanted them to laugh. They would cry when the empire wanted them to cry. And they would die when the empire wanted them to die. Here lies the terrifying turning point. Rebellion, which has always been humanity's spark, would be extinguished before it was ever born. No gladiator would rebel. No slave would flee. No philosopher would dare to question, because the very idea of freedom would simply not exist. The empire would not only control bodies, it would control the imaginable. Picture millions of citizens marching in perfect synchrony, not because they were forced, but because they believed with all their soul that there was no alternative. A humanity satisfied to be a cog. A humanity shaped never to dream of anything beyond the empire. But if the mind had already been conquered, what would remain? If Rome controlled thought, the next step would be inevitable. To mold flesh itself, blood itself, the very biological essence of humanity. What if Rome had learned to manipulate the human body, creating new castes, new species, new citizens designed to serve the eternal empire? What if Rome had discovered that the human body was not a limit, but raw material? What if the empire had learned to shape muscle, blood, and bone the way it shaped marble and iron? What if Rome did not merely rule men, but created them? In our reality, Rome was already advanced in medicine for its time. Rudimentary surgeries, bronze prosthetics, even surprising medical tools for antiquity. Now imagine an empire that never fell, that never stopped experimenting, that never ceased perfecting the body as an instrument of power. The legions would not be just armies. They would be living laboratories. Each soldier, a weapon molded from birth. Rome could have created biological castes, dividing humanity not only by wealth or titles, but by flesh itself. Warriors forged to endure pain, cold, and hunger without faltering. Slaves genetically molded for docility, incapable of rebellion. Administrators with enhanced intelligence, calculating taxes and laws with inhuman precision. Emperors nearly immortal, sustained by medical advances that extended their lives until they seemed divine. The body would cease to be human. It would become an imperial decree. And here comes a brutal turn. Each birth would no longer be chance, but political choice. Social boundaries would become biological boundaries, insurmountable. There would be no rising, no escape. You would not be born free or enslaved. You would be born programmed to serve. Biology would replace chains. Blood would replace prisons. Picture the Colosseum packed. Not to see ordinary gladiators, but human monsters, hybrids, experiments created to entertain the masses and terrify enemies. Picture families divided not by classes, but by species. A humanity shattered and rebuilt at the whim of the empire. And then comes the question sharper than any gladius. If Rome had shaped not only the mind, but also the body, would there be anything human left in us? But flesh still has a limit, death, and sooner or later, Rome would turn its obsession toward it. For the only enemy the empire never accepted was time. And what if Rome had conquered immortality? What would happen to an empire and to rulers who simply never die? What if Rome had discovered the formula of immortality? What if the emperors never died and the eagles of the empire hovered over the earth for millennia without interruption? What if time, the only enemy no one escapes, had been defeated? In our reality, Rome fell in part because its leaders died. Civil wars, bloody successions, internal disputes. Each death of an emperor opened the door to chaos. But in an empire that never fell, science, already advanced, would have been directed toward a single purpose: to prevent the end. Alchemy, medicine, experimentation, all channeled to prolong life. And when prolonging was no longer enough, replacement. Organs exchanged, flesh regenerated, blood renewed. The emperor would not merely be a ruler. He would become eternal. The promise of immortality may seem, at first glance, a gift. But in Rome, it would be a curse. Think of leaders who never leave the throne, laws that never change, ideas that never evolve, an empire that never renews itself. Death is painful, but it makes room for the new. In eternal empire, there would be no room. The same iron fist, clenched for centuries, would crush entire generations. And then comes the cruelest turn. Immortality would not be offered to all. It would be a privilege, a gift for emperors, for senators, for generals. The people, mortal, would serve eternally under rulers who never age. Decade after decade, century after century, entire families born and dead under the same cold, unchanging gaze of the same emperor. Time for the people would keep flowing, but for power it would have stopped. Imagine looking to the sky and seeing the same face on statues, coins, and proclamations for 500, 1,000, 2,000 years. the same voice issuing commands, the same hand signing decrees. A world where history does not move, where the future is suffocated by an eternal present, where Rome, instead of falling, petrifies the entire world in its shadow. But here lies the final frontier. If Rome defeated death sooner or later, it would seek to conquer the cosmos as well. For an eternal empire would not be content with ruling the earth. It would seek the universe. And what if Rome had become the first interplanetary empire, spreading its legions beyond Earth and casting its shadow upon the stars? What if Rome had launched itself into space thousands of years before us? What if the imperial eagles waved not only over walls and colosseums, but over distant moons and alien worlds? What if humanity's first interplanetary empire had been born 2,000 years ago? In our reality, the fall of Rome delayed centuries of science and technology. But in an eternal empire, the continuous accumulation of knowledge would have created something unimaginable. Ships forged in steel, energy harvested from the sun, machines calculating celestial trajectories long before Galileo or Newton. And Rome, insatiable, would never have limited itself to Earth. The legions that once marched across deserts and forests would now cross the cosmic void. Each moon would be a fortress, each planet a province. But space is not only a stage for glory. It is empty, cold, relentless. And Rome's expansion would not be for everyone. Entire colonies would be built at the cost of cosmic slaves, sent to hostile worlds where life could barely take root. Entire peoples would be forced to dwell in caves on Mars, to mine frozen moons, to breathe synthetic air under the watch of immortal centurions. Rome would turn the dream of exploration into the nightmare of infinite domination. And then the twist, contact with the unknown, because among the stars, Rome would not be alone. They would be the first to perhaps see signs of life beyond Earth. And, true to their nature, they would not seek dialogue. They would seek conquest. The universe would not be a mystery to explore, but a territory to subjugate. Imagine legions marching not on stone, but on the red dust of Mars. Golden eagles rising on distant moons. Colosseums built on orbital rings, where gladiators fought on the glow of Saturn. Rome, no longer eternal only on Earth, but cosmic, a galactic empire born centuries before our space age. But the farther Rome expanded, the more the final question would become inevitable. What if humanity had never known freedom? Only the eternal weight of the imperial eagle. What if Rome, instead of falling, had shaped not only the world, but the destiny of the entire human species? What if we had never known freedom? What if from Rome's first cry to humanity's last breath, we had been chained beneath the same shadow? What if our destiny had never been our own? The empire that never fell would have shaped not only cities, armies, or laws. It would have shaped the very essence of humanity. Centuries without breaks, without collapses, without rebirths. A continuous line of iron, stretching across generations like an unbreakable chain. History, as we know it, would never have blossomed. There would be no Middle Ages, no Renaissance, no Enlightenment, no room for doubt, for revolutions, for ideas that challenge power. Everything would be Rome. Everything would be eternal. But what is eternity without choice? What is glory without the risk of failure? What is humanity without the right to err, to reinvent itself, to fall and begin again? Rome might have given us progress, power, perhaps even immortality, but it would have stolen our essence, the uncertainty, the chaos, the fragility that make us human. And here emerges the darkest revelation. Perhaps the fall of Rome was not a tragedy, but a liberation. Perhaps collapse was not the end of civilization, but humanity's chance to breathe, to question, to forge new paths. Perhaps ruin was what saved us from an eternal, suffocating fate. Imagine looking at the night sky and, instead of free stars, seeing only imperial symbols glowing in every constellation. A universe where nothing belongs to you, where even your dreams are born bearing the seal of the empire. And now think, will we truly prefer the chaos of the fall or the petrified order of an eternal Rome? Which would be the real nightmare? Rome fell, and perhaps in its fall we discovered what it means to be human. Because only in the silence left by the ruins is freedom born. If this scenario left you unsettled, imagine the other what ifs we have yet to tell. Comment below. Should Rome have lasted forever, or was its fall our salvation?